According to a legend reported in the Persian epic poem, the Shah-Nameh, around 400 AD, a Sasanian king learned towards the end of his reign that the poor could not afford to enjoy music, and he asked the king of India to send him 10,000 lute-playing experts. When the musicians arrived, the king gave each one an ox, a donkey, and a donkey load of wheat so that they could live on the agriculture and play music for free for the poor. But the musicians ate the oxen and the wheat and came back a year later with their cheeks hollowed with hunger. The king, angered with their having wasted what he had given them, ordered them to pack up their bags and go wandering around the world on their donkeys. The Hungarian Gypsies, or Roma, are an Indo-Aryan ethnic group that came from a single population that left northwestern India about 1500 years ago. Over 70% of the males belong to a lineage that appears unique to the Roma. They are a dispersed people, but their most concentrated populations are located in Europe, especially Central, Eastern, and Southern Europe. The ancestors of modern-day Romani people were previously Hindu, but adopted Christianity or Islam depending on their respective regions through which they had migrated. That said, the Roma continue to practice Shaktism, a practice with origins in India whereby a female consort is required for the worship of a god. An aspect of Roma culture which often has intrigued many is their practice of divination, or fortune-telling. Fortune-telling is commonly associated with the Romani people, and for good reason, as divination forms an integral aspect of Romani culture dating back centuries. As with Romani tradition, Roma fortune tellers are always female.
Welcome, Terence.
It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to be with you again. You know, shamanistic peoples and early peoples throughout the entire world have all been involved in systems of what we call divination. It could be throwing bones, or using the I Ching, or looking at the entrails of animals, or clouds of smoke. But each system seemed to involve some sort of a unique way of linking the human mind with the very nature of time itself in order to understand cycles of time and understand perhaps even to predict the future.
Yes, well, it's certainly true that pre-literate and Aboriginal peoples have had an obsession with time. However, it's an obsession shared by the historical societies as well. Time seems to be the dimension about which we have the greatest anxiety, perhaps because it's the dimension into which we see with the least clarity. Numerous peoples throughout the world have dealt with this lack of clarity as far as time is concerned by developing various methods of divination, or sortilege as it's called. The Maya to this day practice sortilege of a very complicated sort in the highlands of Guatemala. African peoples have complex divinatory systems.
And we don't have to even mention the enormous sales of the I Ching and Tarodex and astrology products here in the United States.
Yes, the I Ching is the divinatory system ne plus ultra. It seems to very early have captured the imagination of Western Orientalists, James Legge and Richard Wilhelm. Their translations made it available to the Western world, and the psychologist Carl Jung, in inventing and discussing the phenomenon that he called synchronicity, popularized the I Ching by using it as an example of this particular phenomenon. The thing which amazed me about the I Ching and caused me to become so deeply involved with it is this fact that it seems to work against all rational expectation. The carrying out of this random ritualistic activity seems then to give a reading which is in fact applicable to the unique situation. Now, Jung's explanation of this was what he called acausal connectedness or synchronicity. This was simply the idea that it was possible for there to be a coincidence of congruence between an internal state, a psychological state, and an exterior event. An obvious example of this would be you think of someone you haven't thought of for years, and an hour later in the mail a letter arrives from them. And Jung was fascinated by these kinds of apparent coordinations of the interiorized psychic sphere and the exterior three-dimensional objective world. For instance, I'm sure you've noticed that every day is rather like every other day. Nevertheless, I'm sure you've also noticed that some days are radically different than others. Well, this sameness but different rule applies on all levels in a temporal hierarchy. Centuries are rather like each other, and yet occasionally a century will come along that is quite anomalous. We call this sameness and difference nesting fractal. This is a new branch of mathematics. And quite simply, what the Chinese discovered circa 3000 BC was the fractal nature of time, that the rules of expression of temporal elements which govern the rise and fall of dynasties also govern the rise and fall of love affairs and moods. The Chinese understood that these temporal elements were, in a sense, creating interference patterns with each other, much in the way that pure tones struck out on a keyboard will, through their interference with each other, create a melody. So that, for instance, if I find myself sitting in Hadrian's hamburger joint enjoying a burger, by this theory, there would actually be a relationship between that act and the Emperor Hadrian's campaigns in Britain before the fall of the Roman Empire. Everything was caused by its analogical resonances with past and future events which had the same temporal elements embedded in them.
We've been talking very intensively about the I Ching, which is one system, a very popular and profound and highly respected system of this type. But there are other comparable systems. For example, there's astrology.
That's right. Astrology is another one of these systems that seeks to define prepotent relationships in nature that can be known by man in order to ease movement into the future. The success of astrology, I think, is borne out by its persistence. I think basically there is a tradition in Central Asia of the so-called stilling the heart techniques vis-a-vis yoga. And these are techniques where vital functions are suppressed. Breathing becomes very minimal. All exterior inputs are suspended. And eventually, I think the Chinese sages who practiced this form of meditation noticed a flux at the center of the stillness. which they called Tao, and which they set out to phenomenologically describe, not knowing whether it was physics, organism, or deity. And they did not prejudge this question. They simply gave a phenomenological description of the transcendental flux that they encountered in states of deep yogic ecstasy. And lo and behold, it turns out that this is the perfect technique for studying time. Time is not a phenomenon where you build machines with 8-kilometer diameters that cost trillions of dollars. Time is a phenomenon to be studied by attending dinner parties, perhaps, or pursuing love affairs, or watching the passing of the seasons. Activities much more commiserate with our vision of the Taoist sage than the white-coated scientist of the present world religion of science. So really, I think it was an involvement in organism and in the human experience.
In other words, the laboratory for studying time would not so much be our observatories or our systems of quartz clocks, but rather looking inside of ourselves, observing our own organism.
That's exactly precise. A curious phenomenon called synchronicity, the coincidental meshing of interior psychic events and exterior events in the real world. It lays a basis for us to understand the unity of ourselves with the real world that our present approach makes difficult to discern.
The Roma people have historically been associated with fortune-telling, with common methods of fortune-telling including palmistry, coffee or tea leaf reading, crystal balls, and tarot card reading, amongst others. While the tarot was used by Romani people when telling fortunes, it was also used as a Jungian psychological apparatus capable of tapping into, quote, absolute knowledge in the unconscious. Cartomancy is the fortune-telling or divination using a deck of cards and includes all kinds of card reading, of which tarot card reading is just one. The tarot deck is very similar to the standard English playing card, except the suits have different names, and the jack may be replaced by 2 other court cards. It's usually a 78 card deck, and there are 21 or 22 additional picture cards called trumps. Cards can be read for any reason, from revealing past lives, to finding a love match, problem solving, to telling the future. Certain religious sources believe cartomancy, like all forms of divination, is a sin. In fact, the Bible is quite clear on the matter. It is prohibited. This is Robert Sepehr. I'm an independent anthropologist. Check out my books on Amazon.com. Thank you for sharing this video. Don't forget to subscribe. I will see you next time.